They were not warriors. They were not rebels. They were not women who refused. They were women who learned, early, quietly, and without ceremony, that survival required a particular kind of letting go. Not the dramatic surrender of a battlefield, not the visible grief of a public funeral. Something quieter, something that happened inside the body before the mind had time to protest. Ancient Rome is remembered for its legions, its senate, its marble columns rising against a Mediterranean sky. But underneath all of that, beneath the forums and the aqueducts and the speeches, there was another Rome. A Rome made of kitchens and birthing rooms and arranged betrothals. A Rome where half the population lived their entire lives inside a system that had been designed, refined, and enforced long before any of them arrived in the world. This is not a story about exceptional women. This is a story about ordinary ones and what they had to release in order to keep moving forward. If you have ever looked at Roman history and wondered what the women were actually doing, not the empresses, not the famous poisoners, not the mythologized priestesses, but the real ones, the ones who woke up before sunrise and managed households and buried children and grew old inside walls they never chose, then what follows will change the way you see that world entirely. If this kind of history makes you see the past with more depth, consider subscribing. These scripts take time to build, and there are still many stories waiting to be told. To understand what Roman women had to let go of, you first have to understand what Rome believed about them. Rome was not subtle about this. The law was not subtle. The philosophy was not subtle. From the earliest legal texts, the 12 Tables, codified around the 5th century BCE, Roman society established a principle that would govern female existence for centuries. Women required a guardian, a tutor, a male figure, father, husband, brother, or legally appointed representative, whose consent was technically required for major legal and financial decisions. This was not incidental, it was architectural. The Roman family was structured around the concept of patria potestas, the power of the father. The paterfamilias held legal authority over every member of his household: wife, children, grandchildren, slaves, clients. His word was, in the most literal legal sense, law within those walls. A daughter born into a Roman household was born into a hierarchy she had not agreed to and could not exit through willpower alone. Picture a city of perhaps 1 million people at the height of the Republic. The streets narrow, loud, layered with sound, vendors calling out prices, cartwheels grinding on stone, the smell of bread from bakeries mixing with the sharper odor of the tanneries nearby. Insulae, multi-story apartment buildings, rising 5 and 6 stories in the crowded quarters, laundry strung between windows, children running along corridors. The wealthy lived differently, of course, in domus, enclosed private homes built around central courtyards, gardens hidden from the street, fountains quiet in the interior air. But whether a woman lived in a ground-floor domus or a third-floor insula apartment, the structural reality was the same. Her time was organized around the household. She woke before her family. She managed the slaves, if the family had them, or did the work herself if they did not. Grinding grain, tending fires, overseeing the production of cloth, because Roman households of even modest means were expected to produce their own textiles. Woolworking was not a hobby. It was an expectation so deeply embedded in Roman female identity that it appeared in marriage ceremonies, in epitaphs, in moralizing literature. Domiceda lanifica, she who stays home and works wool. This was a compliment. This was the ideal. A Roman girl understood her role not through formal instruction, but through absorption. She watched her mother. She watched the older women in the household. She understood, without anyone explaining it directly, that her value was connected to her conduct, her modesty, her silence in public, her management of domestic affairs, her fertility. And then, sometime between the ages of 12 and 14, often younger by modern standards, she was married. Not to someone she had chosen, to someone her father had chosen. And this is where the first thing had to be released. The girl who entered a Roman marriage, especially in the earlier Republican period, was not entering a partnership. She was transferring. Under the older form of marriage called manus, she passed from the legal authority of her father directly into the legal authority of her husband. She became, in a formal sense, equivalent to a daughter in his household. Her previous family ties, her previous legal identity, her previous claim to inheritance, all of it reorganized around a single transaction conducted between men. By the late Republic and into the imperial period, sine manu marriage, marriage without this transfer of legal control, became more common. A woman technically remained under her birth family's guardianship. This was, in some ways, a loosening, but it did not change the daily texture of her life inside that marriage. It did not give her the right to refuse the arrangement. It did not change the expectation that she would produce children, manage the home, and conduct herself in ways that reflected well on her husband's reputation. What had to go first was not a possession. It was not a legal right, because she had few of those to begin with. What had to go first was the future she had imagined for herself, if she had been allowed to imagine one at all. There is a word that appears repeatedly in Roman sources when describing the ideal woman: pudicitia. It is usually translated as chastity, but that translation flattens it. Pudicitia was not simply the absence of sexual transgression. It was a total orientation of the self, modesty in speech, restraint in movement, control of the gaze, management of desire, the studied invisibility of a woman who understood that her visibility itself was a potential problem. It was not a virtue a woman chose. It was a virtue a woman owed to her father, to her husband, to Rome itself. And this is where the second thing had to be released: her body. Not in the dramatic way that word might suggest. Roman law did not reduce women to property in the crude sense, but the body of a Roman woman, particularly a woman of citizen class, was understood as something that existed within a social contract she had never signed. Her virginity before marriage was her family's concern. Her fertility inside marriage was her husband's concern. Her appearance in public was the community's concern. What she wore, how she walked, whether she made eye contact with strangers, whether her garments fell correctly, whether her hair was dressed in a way appropriate to her status, all of this was legible to everyone around her, and everyone around her felt entitled to read it. The stola, the long outer garment worn by Roman matrons, was not fashion. It was a uniform. It announced her status as a married citizen woman. It communicated that she was under male protection and therefore not available, not ambiguous, not open to interpretation. Prostitutes and women of lower social standing were not permitted to wear it. The garment itself was a boundary. The boundary was not hers to set. Walk through a Roman street as a matron, and you understand immediately that your body is broadcasting information you did not choose to broadcast. Your clothing tells them who you belong to. Your pace tells them whether you are modest or bold. Your eyes, cast downward, confirm that you understand the rules. Now imagine learning, gradually, that the only way to move through that world without friction, without comment, without danger, without the specific exhaustion of being watched and assessed, was to stop thinking of your body as yours at all. This was not submission in the way a modern observer might categorize it. It was adaptation. It was the quiet reorganization of self that happens when a person understands, at a cellular level, that certain battles will cost more than they will ever return. The third thing Roman women had to release was time. Not in the abstract sense. Literal time. The hours of the day, the seasons of the year, the decades of a life. Organized not around personal desire or individual ambition, but around biological and social rhythms that belong to the household, to the family line, to the continuation of Rome itself. A Roman woman in a household of moderate means spent the majority of her waking hours in labor that left no monument. Wool working alone, spinning, weaving, the endless production of cloth that clothed the family could occupy multiple hours each day. Water had to be managed. Food had to be prepared or supervised if slaves were available. Children required constant attention, especially in the years before they were old enough to move independently through the world. Religious observances inside the home, the maintenance of the lararium, the small household shrine where offerings were made to the lares, the household gods, were largely women's responsibility. These were not optional. They were the tissue that held domestic life together, and underneath all of this labor ran a quieter current of anxiety. Childbirth in ancient Rome was not a medical event managed by professionals in a controlled environment. It was a domestic crisis that could become a fatal one at any moment. Roman women knew this. They had watched sisters die in labor. They had watched neighbors survive the birth, only to lose the child to fever within the first weeks. They had watched women survive both and then face the same risk again within the year, because contraception was unreliable, because the desire for male heirs meant that pregnancy continued until the family felt satisfied, because a woman's fertility was one of her primary social obligations. The mortality figures are sobering even at a distance of 2,000 years. Estimates suggest that Roman women faced significant risk with every pregnancy. Maternal mortality rates, while difficult to calculate precisely for the ancient world, were high enough that death in childbirth was a recognized, expected possibility. Not a rare tragedy, but a known outcome that women carried with them through every pregnancy, like a weight no one discussed directly. What this meant in practice was that a Roman woman could not afford, in any sense of the word, to be attached to the future. Not because Romans lacked emotional depth. They grieved. The epitaphs left behind by Roman families show tenderness, sorrow, love expressed in the particular restraint of a culture that did not always allow itself to say things directly. Husbands mourned wives in language that breaks through the formal conventions of funerary inscription and lands as something unmistakably human. Children were mourned with a grief that needed no translation. But grief was also something that had to be managed. The fourth thing Roman women had to release, and this is the one that required the most invisible work, was the expectation of permanence. Not permanence of the self, permanence of everything she built. A child could die before the age of 5. Roman demographic data suggests that somewhere between a third and half of all children born did not survive to adulthood. A woman could spend a decade raising children and lose them to fever, to accident, to the particular cruelties of an ancient urban environment. She could spend years building a household economy, managing slaves, cultivating relationships with merchants, maintaining the networks of social obligation that kept a Roman family functioning, and lose it all to her husband's financial ruin, to war, to the unpredictable turns of political fortune that swept through Roman society with regularity. She built anyway. She had to, because the building was the only thing she controlled. There is something that Roman sources almost never say directly. But that becomes visible when you read them carefully enough, when you look not at what was celebrated, but at what was regulated. Fear, not the fear of women, the fear of women. Rome built an entire architecture of restriction around female behavior, legal, social, religious, economic. And the sheer comprehensiveness of that architecture tells you something important. You do not construct that many walls around something you consider harmless. You do not write that many laws governing female movement, female speech, female financial activity, female sexuality, if you genuinely believe that women are simply passive recipients of male authority. The restrictions were not incidental. They were a response to what Roman men understood, at some level, that women were capable of. And this brings us to the fifth thing Roman women had to release: influence exercised openly. Because influence itself, the real kind, the kind that moved decisions and shaped outcomes, was never entirely absent from Roman women's lives. It simply had to travel underground. A Roman matron of the upper classes could not vote. She could not hold political office. She could not speak in the Senate or serve as a magistrate or command armies. The formal structures of Roman public life were male spaces, and the boundary was enforced not just by law, but by the full weight of social expectation and philosophical conviction. Aristotle's ideas about female rationality, diminished, incomplete, requiring male governance, had moved through Hellenistic culture into Roman intellectual life and provided a respectable theoretical foundation for arrangements that served male interests. But informal influence was another matter entirely. A Roman matron with a powerful husband was positioned at the center of a web of social relationships that carried real weight. She hosted. She received visitors. She maintained friendships with other women of her class whose husbands also held power. She shaped her children's education, their values, their understanding of which families were allies and which were threats. She managed the household economy with enough sophistication that a well-run domus was a genuine political asset, a place where alliances were cemented over dinner, where information moved, where the soft architecture of Roman elite society was continuously constructed and maintained. This was not nothing. Roman men knew it was not nothing, which is precisely why so much anxious energy went into policing it. The women who navigated this space most successfully were the ones who understood a fundamental rule. The influence had to be invisible. The moment it became visible, the moment a woman was seen to be directing rather than advising, deciding rather than suggesting, leading rather than supporting, the machinery of social censure activated with remarkable speed. Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi, is remembered in Roman tradition as the ideal of educated, influential Roman motherhood. She raised two sons who became some of the most consequential political figures of the late Republic. Her influence over their formation was celebrated. But note the structure of that celebration. She was honored as a mother. Her power was legitimate because it flowed through her sons, because it operated within the channel that Roman society had designated acceptable for female agency. The women who stepped outside that channel, who exercised influence in ways that were too visible, too direct, too unmediated by a male figure, were remembered differently. They were remembered as dangerous. The sixth thing Roman women had to release was grief expressed without restraint. This sounds minor. It was not. Roman funerary practice assigned women a specific and paradoxical role. They were expected to grieve visibly, to mourn loudly, to tear their hair, to express the emotional weight of loss in ways that were publicly legible. Professional mourners were often female. The performance of grief was, in a formal sense, women's work, and yet that same grief, when it became too persistent, too consuming, too disruptive to the functioning of the household and the continuation of male authority within it, had to be contained. A widow was expected to mourn. She was also expected to remarry, particularly if she was still of childbearing age, particularly if her husband's family or her own family had strategic reasons for a new alliance. The period considered appropriate for mourning before remarriage was defined not by the woman's internal timeline, but by social convention. 10 months was the traditional minimum before a widow could remarry without social censure, a period connected to the Roman concern with establishing paternity, ensuring that any child born after the husband's death could not be confused with the offspring of a new union. The grief was real. The pressure to move beyond it was also real. And the negotiation between those two realities, the internal experience of loss and the external expectation of functional recovery, was something each woman had to conduct alone, inside herself, without a language that fully acknowledged the contradiction. Because Rome did not have much patience for female interiority, that interrupted the social calendar. And this connects directly to the seventh thing, the one that perhaps required the most continuous, lifelong effort to release. The expectation that the system would see her, not appreciate her, not reward her, simply see her. Acknowledge the fullness of what she was, what she managed, what she endured, what she built and rebuilt and built again inside a structure that credited the outcomes to the men whose names appeared in the historical record. The Roman epitaphs left by ordinary families are, in this sense, quietly devastating. Again and again, women are described in the same compressed vocabulary: casta, pia, lanifica, domiceda, chaste, dutiful, woolworking, homekeeping. These were compliments. They were also erasures. They reduced an entire human life, its specific texture, its particular intelligence, its individual negotiations with an unforgiving world, to a checklist of compliant behaviors. And yet, there is something else that appears in those epitaphs if you look past the formulaic language. There is tenderness. There is specific detail. A woman described as having managed the household during her husband's long absence, as having taught her daughters to read, as having been someone whose conversation was missed, whose judgment was relied upon, whose presence organized the world around her in ways that only became fully visible in her absence. The system did not see them completely, but the people who lived beside them often did. There is a temptation, when looking back at a world like this, to organize it into a simple moral verdict. To say, Rome was cruel to its women. To say, these lives were diminished, these women were victims, this system was wrong. And there is truth in that. There is real truth in that. The restrictions were real. The pain was real. The losses, the children, the autonomy, the unnamed interior lives, were real losses, measured in individual human cost across centuries. But the verdict, if delivered too quickly, closes something that should stay open. Because what the lives of Roman women actually reveal is not simply a story of oppression. It is a story about the relationship between human beings and the systems that contain them. And that story is considerably more unsettling than a simple moral verdict allows. The women who survived Rome, not just biologically, but psychologically, socially, as agents of meaning inside a world that constrained them, did not survive by refusing the system. They survived by understanding it with a precision that most of the men around them never needed to develop, because the men were never required to understand it from the outside. They knew which rules were absolute and which had flexibility. They knew which forms of influence were tolerated and which would trigger punishment. They knew how to move within a structure without appearing to move it. They knew, in the most practical and unsentimental sense, what could be held on to, and what had to be released, and they made those calculations continuously, across entire lifetimes, without anyone acknowledging that the calculations were being made at all. This was not weakness dressed up as strength. This was a form of intelligence that the system never gave them credit for, and it shaped Rome in ways that Rome itself was never quite willing to admit. Consider what the Roman household actually was. It was not simply a domestic space, it was an economic unit, a religious institution, a site of political alliance, a mechanism for the transmission of cultural values across generations. The domus was where Roman identity was reproduced, not in the Senate, not on the battlefield, but in the daily work of raising children who understood what it meant to be Roman, who knew the gods, who knew the obligations of their class, who had been trained in the specific combination of discipline and dignity that Roman elite culture considered essential. That work was overwhelmingly women's work. The senators who debated in the Forum had been formed, in their earliest and most impressionable years, by women. The generals who commanded legions had learned the foundational vocabulary of honor and duty inside households managed by women. The values that Romans considered distinctively, essentially Roman, gravitas, pietas, virtus in its broadest sense, were transmitted through a domestic culture that women maintained, supervised, and animated every single day. Rome could not have been Rome without this, and Rome never found an adequate way to say so. The seventh release, the expectation of being fully seen, was perhaps the most permanent of all, because it was the one that the system was most structurally incapable of offering. Recognition would have required acknowledging contribution. Acknowledging contribution would have complicated the philosophical and legal frameworks that justified male authority. And complicated frameworks are dangerous to systems that depend on appearing natural, inevitable, simply the way things are. So the work remained invisible. The intelligence remained unacknowledged. The losses remained private. And generation after generation of Roman women made their calculations, released what had to be released, held onto what could be held, and continued. What does it mean that this pattern, this specific combination of structural constraint, invisible labor, enforced release, and unacknowledged contribution, was not unique to Rome? It appears in ancient Greece, where Athenian women lived in even more severe legal and spatial restriction than their Roman counterparts. It appears in ancient Egypt, where women had more formal legal rights than almost anywhere else in the ancient world, and still operated within a hierarchy of gender that shaped every significant decision of their lives. It appears in ancient China, in ancient Mesopotamia, in the villages of first-century Judea, in the courts of medieval Europe, in the plantation households of the 18th century, in the suburban domestic arrangements of the 20th. The specific rules change. The specific things that have to be released change. The underlying structure, a system that extracts enormous value from women while withholding proportional recognition, legal standing, or formal power, persists across civilizations with a consistency that cannot be explained by coincidence. This is what makes Roman women's lives genuinely important to understand. Not as curiosities, not as cautionary tales, not as evidence of how far we have come, which is a comfortable framing that distances us from the discomfort of the pattern. They are important because they reveal something about how power actually works. Not the dramatic power of armies and edicts, but the quieter, more durable power of systems that organize human life so thoroughly that their organizing principles become invisible, become natural, become simply the way things are. The women who woke before sunrise in a Roman insula, who managed wool and water and children and grief and religious obligation and social reputation and household economy, who made their releases quietly and without ceremony. Those women were not living at the margins of history. They were living at its center. And the fact that history took so long to look directly at them, the fact that the looking is still, in many ways, incomplete, is itself part of the story. Not an accident, not an oversight, a consequence. A consequence of the same system, still working, centuries after Rome fell, in the only way it knew how to work, exactly as designed.